Imagine that you're catching up with an old friend you haven't seen in years. The two of you meet at a busy cafe one morning, and, perching on two uncomfortable bar chairs, you begin a disjointed conversation in between ordering, drinking, and paying for your drinks. The noise in the cafe means you're struggling to hear every word, and as your friend starts telling you about what's been happening in their life for the last 5 years, you realize your attention is drifting, and you're finding the conversation boring. Later, when you get home, you think with some disappointment that the meeting didn't go so well. You used to be great friends, but the meeting earlier that day was so awkward and lacking in connection that you're wondering if it's worth staying in touch at all. So, what happened? The answer is simple: a lack of preparation. Good listening and communication skills, more generally, are things we all take for granted, right up until they're not there, and we sorely feel their absence. Most of us understand that if you're giving a speech, you need to prepare some notes and practice. If you're attending a class, you need to come ready to take notes and pay attention. If you're sitting down to write an important email, you need to take the time to plan it all out. Yet when it comes to communicating, we all seem to assume that this most essential skill will more or less come naturally, without any planning or preparation. While we all recognize the importance of structuring our thoughts and ideas when it comes to speaking, or writing, teaching, etc., we can't forget that there is just as much intentionality required on the other side of things, the listening. The reason we do this is because we think of speaking and writing as active and listening as passive. We imagine that listening is simply not doing. And how many ways can there be of not doing anything, right? This misconception, however, is at the heart of our misunderstanding about how to communicate better. Listening is just as important as speaking, if not more so, and it takes just as much skill, deliberation, and practice. There's nothing obvious or automatic about it. This, then, is where we will start our mission to become more masterful, intelligent communicators. If you're like most people, chances are you've received exactly zilch in the way of formal training in listening skills. That means, sadly, that you've probably picked up plenty of misconceptions and lazy habits yourself over the years. If we continue to think that listening is easy, automatic, and not so important anyway, we will continue to fail to make any efforts to improve. We may encounter good advice that may genuinely help us communicate better, but ignore it, thinking, that doesn't apply to me. I'm actually already a good listener. Listening is frequently seen as an annoyance or a chore. It is undervalued or ignored. In a society that places a higher value on speaking, listeners do not receive the same level of praise, attention, instruction, or credibility as speakers. They should. Instead, the demand to listen is often conveyed without concrete instruction, and it's often delivered as an emotional threat or power play. You better listen to me. In our attention-depleted but individualistic culture, people are programmed to believe that listening is something you do begrudgingly for the sake of the other person, but also to earn your right to snatch back the limelight and continue to do the more interesting part, getting them to listen to you. In this book, we'll take it as a given that people are not good listeners by default. That doesn't make them unkind or selfish or stupid. You're not any of these things because you don't automatically know how to give a speech or write an essay, right? Rather, listening is a skill like any other. It requires conscious, deliberate effort. As you'll soon see, This effort is almost always rewarded with more satisfying communication, better relationships, and much less conflict and misunderstanding in life. Returning now to our example. What went wrong? Two old friends show up to a casual location and attempt a conversation, but it fails. Hopefully you can see that the issue was simply that they were unprepared. It was taken for granted that communication would just happen all on its own. But then it didn't. A little more care and effort might have steered the encounter in a different direction entirely. Listening readiness may seem an odd concept, but when we can consciously and deliberately set the scene for our conversations, we not only demonstrate our respect for the other person and the interaction we'll have with them, but we also ensure we give that interaction the best chance of success, whatever that may look like for the people involved. Now, nobody is suggesting that you kill all spontaneity and start organizing your everyday conversations with a clipboard and a checklist. It does mean, however, no longer assuming that connection, understanding, and listening will happen on their own without effort. It means, for example, being aware that a noisy and uncomfortable cafe will be distracting and noisy, and purposefully choosing a place instead where you know you can talk to the person face to face in quiet privacy and comfort. It's common to see poor listening skills blamed on narcissism or a lack of consideration for the other person. While this may indeed be the case, we'll certainly address this in later chapters, it's usually more often a question of clumsiness rather than malice. Without giving the act of listening and conversation a special place in our minds, we don't tend to stop and deliberately give it any space or attention on its own, and, consequently, we are rushed or distracted when we attempt to talk to people. And so, too many of us attempt difficult conversations with the TV on in the background, or juggle a conversation while looking at our phones, driving, or doing a dozen other things at the same time. The idea of listening readiness was first introduced by Professor Nadine Marsnik and the International Listening Association. Such readiness is broken down into 3 separate categories: physical, mental, and emotional. Physical preparedness, i.e., are you physically ready to listen? It may seem obvious, but even the most attentive and empathetic person is going to struggle to listen to you if they're being mauled by a lion or haven't eaten in 2 weeks. What might it look like to not be physically ready to listen? Being too hungry, tired, grumpy, inebriated, hot, cold, uncomfortable, or ill to pay proper attention. Being stressed, rushed, or busy with something else. Being too emotionally aggravated to be fully present, e.g., overly angry, sad, or scared. Physical preparedness may simply come down to making sure that the chair is comfortable, nobody is thirsty, and you're not attempting a conversation at 11 p.m. when everyone is fatigued and unable to manage a full-blown discussion about something important. Mental preparedness, i.e., are you mentally ready to listen? Being able to literally comprehend the sounds coming out of the other person's mouth is only a tiny part of listening. Are you psychologically and mentally able to receive what is being shared with you? Lacking the mental readiness to listen means not having the background knowledge to understand what you're being told. For example, missing important contextual information. Not having a clear idea of what the conversation is for, or even that a conversation is or should be happening. Distractions and competing thoughts and ideas, either your own or someone else's. Emotional preparedness, i.e., are you emotionally ready to listen? Arguably, the biggest impediment to listening is not that our ears don't work or that the chair is a little wobbly. It's that we are not emotionally willing to fully place our neutral attention and care onto the other person and the information they're trying to convey to us. In fact, most of what we'll explore in this book returns to these more insidious emotional impediments to proper listening: judgment, prejudice, and lack of empathy. Lacking emotional preparedness looks like entering a discussion with a pre-existing agenda, conversations had under duress, force, or emotional manipulation. For example, one party wants to avoid it, whereas the other wants to force it. Automatically judging someone else's grammar usage, accent, or mode of expression. While it may seem like overkill to carefully consider each of these components before every conversation, the general principle is sound. Do you have a conscious, deliberate intention for how your conversations will play out? Or are you just carelessly letting things unfold as they will? Picture your task merely as setting the stage. Any listening skills you develop won't matter unless you first have a properly designated time and place in which to demonstrate them. Here are 3 more tips to help you better prepare that listening stage. 1. Always approach listening as an active and intentional process that involves standing back from your own thoughts and fully concentrating on what the other person is saying. Recognize the importance of careful listening and understand that true listening requires effort and focus. 2. Acknowledge the significance of looking people in the eyes while they speak. Use eye contact to lock on to the speaker's message and consciously ignore distractions and disruptions in your environment. 3. Recognize the importance of nonverbal communication, which can account for a significant portion of the overall communication experience. Practice reading between the lines by paying attention to body language and voice inflection, as these elements often convey unspoken messages. We'll be exploring each of the above in more detail in the chapters to come, but for now, it's enough to remind yourself, as often as you can, that listening matters. Before you enter any conversation, think to yourself, what do I need to do right now to make myself better prepared to listen? 4 types of listening. In this section, there are 4 main ways to listen, and pseudo-listening isn't one of them. Here's a story you've probably heard before or else lived through yourself. It goes like this. During a conversation, someone complains to their partner, "You're not listening to me." The partner protests and denies this and promptly repeats everything they've just been told in precise detail. "See, I was listening." You can probably guess that this response, however, doesn't ever convince the first partner. Just like there are many, many different ways to speak, write, and express yourself, there are many ways to listen. Not all ways of listening are created equal, and what is appropriate in one context may not be so in another. This is why the first partner may be justified in saying, "You weren't really listening, though." Knowing about the different ways to listen will help you tailor your listening style to the person in front of you, the message you're hearing, and the context you find yourself in. Each listening style is like a tool in your communication inventory that serves a distinct function. There is appreciative listening, empathic listening, comprehensive listening, and critical listening. As your skills improve, however, you will see that there are probably far more shades and nuances in the way you can listen. Appreciative listening, listening for enjoyment. Appreciative listening is when the listener focuses on deriving enjoyment from what is being communicated. This can be akin to listening to music for pleasure. Conversations involve engaging with content that brings joy, inspiration, or amusement. Examples include sermons in places of worship, motivational speeches, or stand-up comedy. Every time someone tells you a really funny or entertaining story, the ideal response is to listen in a way that actively conveys how much you're enjoying the listening. This is because the intention of the message being shared is precisely to create this feeling of enjoyment. It's important, therefore, to not just listen with the intention of enjoyment, but to express and communicate this enjoyment back to the speaker. When to use. Use appreciative listening when the primary goal is to derive enjoyment or inspiration from the communication. This type is suitable for situations where the content is meant to be enjoyed, uplifted, or appreciated. For example, someone delivers an inspiring speech at a family get-together, or your grandmother shares a cute story about your childhood around the dinner table. Tips. 1. Focus actively. Cease other activities, maintain eye contact, and nod affirmatively. Actively engage by refraining from distractions, signaling your attentive presence. 2. Express positivity. Utilize affirmative body language, position toward the speaker, nod, and vocalize agreement. Convey positive engagement through nonverbal cues. 3. Reflect understanding. Practice reflective listening. Summarize or paraphrase key points to show understanding and strengthen the connection with the speaker. Things to avoid. Whatever you do, don't focus on the factual details. These are not relevant. Don't be the, well, actually, person. For example, don't correct your grandmother and tell her the story's details don't add up or make sense. Or attempt to interrupt the inspiring speech with a few comments of your own that give a more realistic take on events. Responding in such a way or getting overly literal will be perceived as rude and cold. You will rightly be perceived as refusing what has been offered in the spirit of a gift. Empathic listening. Listening for feelings. Empathic listening revolves around showing mutual concern and understanding for the speaker's perspective, and it's frequently an emotional perspective. It requires being fully present in the moment, setting aside personal thoughts, and stepping into the speaker's shoes to comprehend their feelings and situation, instead of letting your own perception color things. When to use. Choose empathic listening when building relationships, offering support, or understanding someone else's emotions and experiences. This type is effective in personal conversations, conflict resolution, or situations where emotional connection is essential. Naturally, it's less appropriate in more neutral or professional contexts where emotion is not acknowledged as primary. Tips. 1. Be fully present. Provide full attention and remain impartial. Practice receptive listening by focusing not just on the speaker's words, but on the emotional context behind them and on nonverbal cues that hint toward that person's needs, values, perceptions, and interpretation of an event. 2. Deliberately acknowledge emotions. As we will explore in a later chapter, there is value in deliberately witnessing and labeling the emotions you perceive in others. Demonstrate empathy by acknowledging and validating the person's emotions using their own words. It can also help to thank them for their honesty and openness. 3. Ask reflective, open-ended questions. Demonstrate a willingness to be receptive to what's being shared with you. Pose reflective, open-ended questions that communicate loud and clear your respect for the other person's perspective and your genuine interest in their lives. Things to avoid? Well, contrary to what much popular self-help may suggest, empathy is not a silver bullet for everything. Not every problem can be solved by the addition of more empathy. Specifically, offer empathy and compassion only when the other person wants it and it's appropriate for the situation. Too many people, in their personal need to come across as kind and caring, will override another person's valid desire to not share their emotions. Alternatively, empathic listening may simply be inappropriate in the workplace or with a more superficial acquaintance. Comprehensive listening, listening for data. Comprehensive listening involves actively understanding and processing the informational content of the message. It's essential when receiving information in the form of news, lectures, or directions or instructions. The listener actively engages with the material, takes notes, and evaluates the structure and supporting evidence presented. When to use? Opt for comprehensive listening when the goal is to understand and retain information accurately. One of communication's more basic functions is simply to transfer information from one person to another. This type is essential in academic settings, professional environments, and any situation where the accurate reception and retention of information are critical. That said, it still requires all the same skills used in more empathic listening, i.e., the suspension of judgment, prejudice, and assumption. Tips. 1. Clarify unfamiliar terms. Enhance comprehension by proactively addressing unfamiliar words or concepts. If a term is unclear, ask for clarification to ensure a complete understanding of the message. For example, if someone uses a technical term that you don't understand during a presentation, you might say, "Could you please clarify the term XYZ? I want to ensure I fully grasp your message." 2. Employ content-oriented evaluation. Approach messages with scrutiny and impartial assessment. Content-oriented listeners evaluate information thoroughly, ensuring a balanced perspective. This contributes to a deeper understanding of the message. 3. Utilize sympathetic listening. In situations where understanding emotions is crucial, employ sympathetic listening. Focus on comprehending and acknowledging the speaker's feelings rather than attempting to put yourself in their shoes. This can be a little tricky for people, but just remember that emotions themselves can also be understood as data. We can understand emotions, and we can feel them. Sympathy is the former. Empathy is the latter. Things to avoid. The biggest risk with this form of listening is its misapplication. This could mean using comprehensive listening when a more empathic mode is required, or else treating things that are not factual data as though they are. For example, failing to recognize conjecture and opinion for what it is, and responding to it as though it were neutral, objective fact. Critical listening. Critical listening is focused on evaluating the content of the message, requiring the listener to analyze and make judgments. This type of listening is crucial in scenarios like making informed purchases or understanding complex information, where the listener assesses the validity and implications of the message. When to use? Employ critical listening when the goal is to evaluate the content, make informed decisions, or assess the validity of the information. This type is crucial in situations where critical thinking and analysis are required. You can probably see, however, that evaluating can be perilously close to judging, and so this kind of listening should only be attempted when it's 100% clear that your appraisal is requested and welcome. Tips: 1. Ask clarifying questions. When engaging in critical listening, ask questions to seek clarification and gather more information. For example, I'm interested in this refrigerator, but I'm not clear about the energy efficiency. Can you explain more about its energy-saving features? 2. Evaluate credibility. Assess the credibility of the information source by considering qualifications and reliability. 3. Consider multiple perspectives. Practice critical thinking by considering different viewpoints and weighing the pros and cons. Things to avoid. This kind of listening is, in reality, the least useful and common. It's the one, however, that many of us accidentally fall into at all the wrong times. For example, someone might be sharing an upsetting story with us, and we instantly start listening to find out who is to blame. Or perhaps when someone is sharing their perspective on a certain idea, we immediately start thinking whether we believe it's good or bad, right or wrong, etc. A good rule of thumb is that in most human relationships, evaluation and appraisal of this kind, especially if it's a moral judgment, is almost always unnecessary. Critical is a word that has a clear definition involving the neutral analysis of pros and cons, but it's no coincidence that in everyday usage, this word also means disapproving. Remember that on an emotional level, most people will automatically perceive appraisal as disapproval. Let's return now to the couple at the beginning of the chapter, and the person who was accused of not listening, even though they clearly demonstrated that they were. You may be able to see that the issue here is the kind of listening that was being offered. One partner requires empathic listening, and the other was perhaps offering comprehensive or critical listening. The problem can go the other way, however. Many sensitive, caring types pride themselves on being compassionate and empathic, but are nevertheless poor listeners because they're unable to offer anything but this type of listening. This can be a problem when they are in situations requiring one of the other types. They will just as readily be perceived as not listening. Real empathy, then, can be considered the ability to notice what the situation and the other person actually require of you, and to respond appropriately. And then there's pseudo-listening. One problem is that all the above can be faked. Pseudo-listening is simply the mere appearance of listening without the deeper attention and receptivity that comes with genuine listening. Pseudo-listening can rear its head when people are aware that they should be listening and want to appear as though they are, but they remain uninterested in the actual listening part. This isn't always a bad thing. All of us, sooner or later, need to feign interest out of politeness, and going through the motions may indeed prove to be the easiest way through certain situations. Pseudo-listening, however, can be more of a problem when the person doing it isn't actually aware of what they're doing, i.e., they believe they are listening. Read most how-to articles on how to be a better listener, and you'll almost certainly see a simple list of behaviors, external behaviors, that are designed merely to give the external appearance of thoughtful listening. We're told to make eye contact, to say, uh-huh, and oh, really, now and then, to not interrupt, to nod and smile, etc. The trick is, these are the things that people who are genuinely listening tend to do. But that doesn't mean that doing them automatically means you're listening. If you've ever been on the receiving end of this kind of thing, you'll know just how obvious it is when someone is faking it. Pseudo-listening often comes with a tiny shred of genuine attention, as though the person is scanning selectively, just in case they hear anything they actually are interested in. They may have ears pricked for things that concern them directly, or pay just enough attention to recognize when the other person asks them a question or expects a response. If we're honest, most of us will have to admit that we do this more often than we should. Pseudo-listening is the kind of shallow attention that picks out just a few highlights, and therefore often leads to misunderstandings or crossed wires. It is, in fact, our superficial listening that makes others seem uninteresting, a bit like skimming through a complicated novel and then complaining later that it was boring. On hearing someone speak, you may think to yourself, yeah, I've heard this before. I know where this story is going, and then tune them out. But in doing so, you actually miss the opportunity to learn that you were wrong and that you're about to learn something. It is your lack of engagement itself that drains the life from the conversation, and not the quality of what's being shared with you. When it comes to pseudo-listening, there's no big secret. Just don't do it. In a later chapter, we'll be exploring the power of curiosity and how it can combat this kind of restlessness and distraction when listening to others. But for now, simply be aware that pretending to listen is a waste of your time and is seldom as convincing to the other person as you think. Understanding silence. In this chapter, silence gives conversations depth, meaning, and space to unfold. Don't be afraid to lean back and let people fill that space. Imagine that you have a close friend who comes to you with a serious problem. They're bearing their soul, they're upset, and they lay out a long, complicated story at your feet. Eventually, they take a deep breath, sigh, and stop talking. They're crying a little. What do? A, change the topic and start talking about some good things happening later that week to take their mind off things? B, tell them a story about when and how you overcame a similar challenge yourself? C, give them some inspiring words of encouragement and tell them that you believe in them, whatever happens. D, give them a hug and tell them a joke to cheer them up. E, dawdle as you try to think which of the above responses to pick. Often, particularly in uncomfortable or emotionally heavy conversations, we can find ourselves racking our brains, not quite knowing what to say next. In these moments, we can forget an important option that we always have in the bag, the choice to say nothing at all. A conversation is, of course, a back and forth, a give and take. It's a game of attentional tennis, where the players lob the topic between them, taking turns, as it were. But there's always an invisible player in this conversational game, and it's the one that truly masterful conversationalists have really figured out: silence. It's common to imagine that a flowing conversation is one that is going well, and to panic a little when talking lulls for a moment and things go quiet. Actually, silence plays an important, even essential role in conversations, and it's especially useful if we want to become better listeners. It may sound glib, but you cannot really hear what someone is saying if you're actively talking, or even thinking about talking. It's impossible for someone to say something unless there is an open space into which they can say it. In other words, sometimes people can't really have a conversation because they're too busy talking. By embracing and cultivating the right kind of silence, you are opening up a space into which the other person can put their words, their thoughts, their feelings. If that space is already cluttered with your expectations, your bias, your nervous chatter, or your assumptions about what they're telling you before you even heard it, then you don't have much chance of really hearing them. Whether you want to resolve a conflict, brainstorm a new solution together, tell a story, listen empathetically, find out more about the other person, or simply enjoy an entertaining bit of banter, you are going to need to let the conversation breathe, and that requires enough silence. The best of us can sometimes fail to listen because we have a very fixed agenda of what good listening looks like. A friend may come to us upset and needing to talk, and we may immediately think, okay, cool. Time for me to play the role of a compassionate friend. I'd better make all the right noises and give them a hug and say, you got this. Though this response comes from a place of kindness and concern, it doesn't allow the other person to spontaneously unfold the conversation in the direction it needs to go. The irony is that you may be so focused on playing out the appearance of good listening that you fail to actually listen for real. The next time you encounter a lull in the conversation and a silence appears between you, just pause for a moment and notice it there. Notice your own desire to jump in and fill the space, and just hang back for a few seconds instead. Learning how to work with this silence, rather than just mindlessly filling it, can help you take your conversational skills to the next level. Silence gives them time to think, to feel. It gives you time to do the same, to digest and process what is happening, and to reflect rather than barge ahead. Silence builds trust. It tells people in a deep and sometimes counterintuitive way, I see you, just as you are, just as things are right now. I'm here with you. Silence communicates a presence and a tacit acceptance because we're not trying to fix or change anything. We're not treating the present moment like something to quickly hurry on from, or label, or judge. Silence lets us slow down and take a step back. This can allow us to see creative solutions to problems we may not have noticed before. Silence empowers people. It sends the message, loud and clear, that you believe the other person can and will help themselves without needing you there to talk and fix and solve for them. Silence makes us curious and receptive. Instead of rushing to some conclusion just for the sake of it, we pause a moment in ambiguity and open-endedness and allow ourselves instead to ask questions. Silence helps us normalize and cope with strong emotions. With your silence, you demonstrate that you can hold and contain emotions. When you chatter and nervously fill the silence, it's often because on some level you don't accept the emotional reality and cannot sit with it. On the other hand, being silent in the face of someone's strong emotion can help people feel more able to accept it in themselves. Silence takes the pressure off us. We remember that we are not responsible for everything and everyone, and we don't have to come up with perfect solutions in a split second. We can take our time. We can choose not to respond. By now, most of us know that it's bad to interrupt. If we're honest, though, how often do we interrupt people mentally? In other words, how often do we allow our own internal chatter to start up and interfere with our ability to hear what the other person is saying? We may be externally silent, but internally, We're actually prioritizing listening to ourselves instead of them. Even before they've finished, we're preparing and rehearsing a response to them, or chattering away to ourselves in response. Whether we interrupt in an obvious or not so obvious way, though, the effect is the same. We do not give the other person enough space. We cannot hear them. So the next time you're having a conversation with someone, pay special attention to the little silences. Start to see them as possible invitations to go a bit deeper. Your response to temporary lulls in the conversation can actually steer things in different directions, creating more rapport, understanding, and empathy. When you start noticing all these little spaces, you might realize just how many different things you can do with them. Ways you can respond to silence. Be still and let the silence be. Hold it for 5 to 10 seconds. Don't merely give the impression that you're thinking about what they just said. Genuinely think about it. Remember body language. While pseudo-listening is no good, spare a thought for what you may still be communicating non-verbally. You can be completely silent, but nevertheless express an incredible level of engagement and focus simply by maintaining eye contact, an appropriate facial expression, and open body language angled toward the speaker. Forget yourself. You could use a quiet moment to consider what you think about what's being shared. But what happens when you instead think about what they're feeling? Try to go deeper into their experience. Why did they pause at this exact moment? What do you imagine is running through their mind right now? How do they feel? The interesting thing about switching your focus from yourself to them is how comfortable and easy it makes silences. You may realize that people instantly become a whole lot more interesting to you once you stop trying to decide what you think of them and instead consider what they think of you. Consider your next move. A conversation is like walking a unique path through a maze. At any point, you can stop, consider the crossroads in front of you, and decide which direction to take things. In the silence, pause a beat and ask yourself what the conversation needs, what you need, what they need. If they seem distracted, bored, or restless, you might like to break the silence or end the conversation until a better time. If they suddenly make eye contact and seem to be searching your face, they may want you to say something next. If they're upset or crying, try to imagine what they're feeling and check to see if some physical contact, kind words, or a hug might be warranted. If they seem awkward, uncomfortable, or struggling to speak, you might need to address it differently. Is there anything you want to talk about? Or what's on your mind? If they seem angry or unhappy about the silence, you don't have to apologize or rush to say something. Well, I was just listening to you. Or, I'm thinking about what you said, is honest and often gives people permission to speak frankly and be heard, something they may not be used to. If someone has just been very vulnerable with you or shared something very important or difficult, give it a few seconds before you respond. It will convey a sense of respect for what you've heard. Use silence wisely. Of course, not all silence is golden. If you're genuinely unable to say anything interesting, if you're tired, in a bad mood, or just unable to fully engage, then be upfront about it and see if you can postpone the conversation to a better time. Likewise, just because you are comfortable with silence and can manage a more in-depth and serious conversation, doesn't mean that the other person is ready to do the same. Respect a person's choice to continue speaking superficially. change the topic, or end a conversation they feel uncomfortable in. Sometimes people just want to talk and be heard. Sometimes people just don't want to talk. Silence is only useful when everyone is comfortable with it, and when it is generative and supports connection and empathy. If the silences are getting longer and longer, and one or both of you is beginning to feel the strain, it could simply be a sign to gracefully bow out and pick things up at another time. That's completely normal. Summary. The first task of listening is to be prepared, receptive, and willing. Good listening requires that we are prepared in the same way as if we were planning to give a speech or write an email. Listening readiness comes in 3 categories: physical, mental, and emotional. Take care to properly set the stage in each category. Listening is not passive, and it is as important as speaking, requiring as much skill, deliberation, and practice. Most of us receive no training on how to listen, or wrongly assume we don't need to learn. Listening is a skill that can be learned, and the reward is more satisfying communication, better relationships, and less conflict. There are 4 main ways to listen. Appreciative, focusing on deriving enjoyment from what is being communicated. Empathetic, showing concern and understanding for the speaker's emotional perspective. Comprehensive, understanding and processing the informational content of the message. And critical, evaluating the content of the message, appraising, and making judgments. All approaches have value. The skill comes with being able to tailor your approach to the unique situation you're in and the other person's needs. Pseudo-listening is the mere appearance of listening without the deeper attention and receptivity that comes with genuine listening. Avoid it. Always remember that you have the options to stay silent. That includes mentally. Silence creates space, allows possibilities to unfold, and lets a conversation breathe. This has been Mindful Listening: How to Be Present, Intentional, and Empathetic, written by Patrick King, narrated by Russell Newton. Copyright 2024 by Patrick King. Production copyright by Patrick King.